I was already sitting inside the limousine when they realized they had made a mistake. The kind of mistake you can't take back with an apology or a nervous smile. And as I looked out through the tinted window at the front door of the house I had lived in for over 30 years, I could still hear his voice echoing in my mind, cold and sharp. Stay outside until you learn respect. My own son's words, spoken so casually over dinner, as if he were sending a child to time out instead of his 72-year-old mother. And I remember how quiet the room had become after he said it, how his wife Sophia lowered her eyes just enough to hide the satisfaction in them, how no one reached for me when I stood up. No one said, "Mom, wait." No one even looked uncomfortable, and so I walked to the door, slowly, carefully, as if moving too fast might shatter whatever dignity I still had left. And when I stepped outside, the evening air felt colder than it should have been for early fall, the kind of cold that settles into your bones when you realize you are no longer welcome somewhere you once belonged. And I stood there on the front steps in my house slippers, listening to the faint clink of silverware and the low hum of conversation continuing without me, as if I had never been part of it at all. And for a long moment, I told myself this was temporary, that Daniel would come to his senses, open the door, say he didn't mean it. But the minutes stretched, and the porch light above me flickered on automatically, casting a pale glow over the driveway, and still no one came. And that was when something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a lock clicking into place, because I realized this wasn't a moment of anger. It was a decision, one they had already made long before tonight, and I had simply been the last to understand it. And I remember glancing down at my hands, steady despite everything, and thinking how strange it was that after all these years of giving, of holding that family together, I was now standing outside my own home like a stranger waiting for permission to come in. And that was the exact moment the headlights appeared at the end of the street, long and low and unmistakably expensive, gliding toward the house with a quiet authority that didn't belong to this neighborhood. And as the black limousine came to a smooth stop right in front of the driveway, I saw the curtain in the living room shift, just slightly, someone inside finally paying attention. But by then it was already too late, because the driver had stepped out, straightened his jacket, and was walking toward me with a calm certainty that told me one thing very clearly: they had no idea who I had just called, and they had no idea what was about to happen next. The driver stopped a few steps in front of me and gave a slight nod, the kind that carried more respect than I had felt all evening, and in a calm, professional voice he said, "Mrs. Whitmore, your car is ready." As if this moment had been scheduled all along, as if I had not just been standing outside my own front door like an inconvenience. And for a second I simply looked at him, not because I did not understand, but because I wanted to be certain this was real, that this quiet shift in the air was not just something I imagined to comfort myself. And behind me I heard the faint creak of the front door opening, slow and hesitant now, very different from the way it had closed so firmly earlier. And I did not turn around right away. I let them wait, just as I had waited, feeling the weight of their attention settle on my back for the first time that evening. And then Daniel's voice came, softer now, uncertain. "Mom, what is going on?" And it was strange how quickly the tone had changed, how the same man who had dismissed me minutes ago now sounded like he was searching for something solid to hold on to. And I finally turned, meeting his eyes, noticing the confusion there, the flicker of doubt, and just behind him Sophia stood perfectly still, her expression composed but her hands clasped a little too tightly in front of her, as if she were trying to keep control of something slipping away. And for a moment no one spoke, the scene held in a silence that felt heavier than any argument. And I realized then that nothing I could say would matter as much as what I chose not to say. So I offered no explanation, no defense, only a small, polite nod, the same kind I had given strangers my entire life. And then I turned back toward the driver, who had already opened the rear door of the limousine, revealing a soft interior glow that felt warm and distant compared to the cold porch light behind me. And as I stepped forward, I could feel their eyes following every movement, measuring, recalculating, trying to understand how the situation had shifted without their permission. And Daniel took a step closer, his voice rising slightly. "Mom, wait, where are you going?" But I did not stop, because for the first time that evening I did not feel the need to answer him. and that realization settled over me with a quiet certainty, the kind that does not demand attention but changes everything all the same. And as I lowered myself into the seat, the leather smooth and steady beneath my hands, I allowed myself one last glance back at the house, at the doorway where I had stood just minutes before, and I saw it clearly now, not as my home, but as a place I had already outgrown. And when the door closed beside me with a soft, final sound, it felt less like leaving and more like returning to something I had almost forgotten. And as the car began to move, slow and deliberate down the driveway, I caught a glimpse of Daniel standing there, uncertain and still, and Sophia just behind him, her composure cracking in the smallest of ways. And I knew without needing to hear a single word that they were only just beginning to understand that the woman they had asked to stand outside was not the woman who had just left. The city lights stretched across the window like a reflection of a life I had once believed belonged to someone else, distant and untouchable. And as the limousine carried me farther away from that house, I sat quietly with my hands folded in my lap, feeling the steady rhythm of the road beneath me and the strange calm that had settled in my chest. Not relief exactly, but clarity. The kind that comes when something you have ignored for years finally reveals itself all at once. And I realized that this night had not begun at that dinner table. It had been building for a long time, in small moments I had chosen to overlook, in conversations where my voice had been gently redirected, in decisions made without asking me even though I was still living under that roof. And I remembered the first time Sophia suggested turning my sewing room into a guest office. How she had smiled so sweetly while explaining how practical it would be, how Daniel had nodded without even glancing in my direction, and how I had agreed because it seemed like such a small thing at the time, just a room, just a change. And then there were other things, the way the mail stopped coming in my name and was instead addressed to them, the way my favorite chair in the living room slowly became a place for decorative pillows no one actually used, the way conversations would pause when I entered and resume only after I left. And each time I told myself it was nothing, that families evolve, that I needed to be understanding. But sitting there in that quiet car, I could see the pattern clearly now. It had never been about space or convenience. It had been about control, about slowly rewriting the boundaries of a home until I no longer fit inside it. And I let out a slow breath, watching the reflection of my own face in the glass, older than I remembered, but steadier too. And for the first time I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had avoided, that I had stayed not because I was needed, but because I had been unwilling to see the truth. And the driver's voice broke gently into my thoughts. "We will be arriving shortly, ma'am." And I nodded, even though he could not see me, my eyes still fixed on the passing lights. And I wondered what Daniel was doing at that moment, whether he was still standing in the driveway trying to understand what had just happened, or if Sophia was already explaining it away, trying to regain control of a situation she no longer fully understood. And a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips, not out of spite, but from the quiet realization that for the first time in a very long while, I was no longer reacting to their choices. I was moving according to my own, and whatever waited for me at the end of this ride was not something they could take away, because it had never belonged to them in the first place. The limousine slowed as it turned through a set of tall iron gates that opened without hesitation, as if expecting me. And for a brief moment I watched them close behind us, sealing off the outside world with a quiet finality that felt different from the door I had left behind. Not exclusion, but protection. And the long driveway curved gently through rows of old oak trees whose branches stretched wide under soft golden lights, leading toward a house that did not need to announce its presence to be understood, large but not excessive, elegant in a way that came from time rather than display. And as we approached the front steps, I felt a familiar sensation settle over me, something I had not felt in years. The sense of arriving somewhere I did not have to explain myself. And when the car came to a stop, the driver stepped out immediately, opening my door with the same quiet respect. And I placed my hand lightly against the frame as I stepped onto the stone driveway, steady and certain, my eyes lifting toward the front entrance where a single figure stood waiting beneath the soft porch light. And even from a distance, I recognized her posture before I could see her face clearly, straight-backed, composed, unmoving in a way that did not demand attention but commanded it all the same. Eleanor Whitmore had never been a woman who needed to raise her voice to be heard. And as I walked toward her, I became aware of the subtle details I had once taken for granted. The way the house seemed to breathe with quiet order, the way nothing felt rushed or uncertain. And when I reached the steps, she studied me for a moment, her gaze steady but not unkind, taking in everything without asking a single question. And I realized then that she already knew, not just what had happened tonight, but everything that had led to it, because Eleanor had always understood more than she ever said. And finally, she inclined her head slightly and spoke in a calm, measured tone. "You took your time." And there was no accusation in her voice, only a simple acknowledgement of something inevitable, and I let out a small breath I had not realized I was holding, answering just as quietly. I needed to see it clearly, and for a brief second something softened in her expression, not quite a smile, but enough to tell me I had not disappointed her, and she stepped aside, gesturing toward the open door behind her, warm light spilling out into the night. And as I crossed the threshold, I felt the weight of the past few hours settle into place. No longer something that controlled me, but something I had moved beyond. And before the door closed, I glanced back once more at the dark stretch of driveway beyond the gates, knowing that somewhere far from here Daniel was still trying to make sense of what he had lost. And inside, Eleanor's voice followed me, steady and certain. "They assumed you had nowhere else to go." And I paused just long enough to answer, my voice calm, my words deliberate. That was their first mistake. The house was quiet in a way that felt intentional, not empty but composed, as if every room understood its place and purpose. And I followed Eleanor through the wide hallway, where soft lighting traced the edges of polished wood floors, each step grounding me further in the reality of where I now stood. And she did not rush ahead or look back to check if I was keeping up. She simply moved forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had already decided how this night would unfold. And when we entered the sitting room, she gestured toward a chair near the window, a simple motion that carried more invitation than any spoken welcome, and I sat down slowly, taking in the familiar scent of polished oak and something faintly floral, the kind of detail that lingers over years rather than being added for show. And Eleanor remained standing for a moment, studying me with the same steady gaze she had held at the door, not searching for weakness, but measuring something deeper, something I had only just begun to understand myself. And then she spoke, her voice calm and even. "Tell me exactly what he said." And I did not hesitate, because there was no longer anything to protect, no version of events I needed to soften or excuse, so I repeated the words as they had been spoken, clear and unfiltered. And when I finished, the room fell silent again, but it was not the kind of silence I had left behind earlier. This one held weight, intention, and something else beneath it, something that felt like movement just below the surface. And Eleanor finally sat across from me, folding her hands neatly in her lap, her expression unchanged except for a slight tightening around her eyes that only someone who knew her well would notice. And she nodded once, as if confirming something she had already suspected. "And you left," she said, not as a question but as a statement, and I met her gaze without looking away. "Yes," I answered simply, and for the first time that evening I felt no need to explain myself further. And she leaned back slightly, her posture still perfect, her voice steady but carrying a quiet finality. "Good." And that single word settled over the room with more force than any raised voice ever could, because it was not approval of what had happened, but of what I had chosen to do next. And she reached toward the small table beside her, pressing a button I had not noticed before, and within moments a man in a dark suit appeared in the doorway, his presence immediate but unobtrusive, as if he had been waiting just out of sight. And Eleanor did not look at him when she spoke, her eyes remaining on me. "Prepare the documents," she said, her tone unchanged. "It is time to correct an assumption." And the man nodded once and disappeared just as quietly as he had arrived, and I felt a slow understanding begin to form, not rushed, not overwhelming, but certain. And Eleanor's gaze softened just enough to acknowledge it. "They believed that house was his," she continued, her voice measured. "They believed you were simply living there." And she paused, allowing the weight of that belief to settle fully before adding, "They were wrong." And I sat there, absorbing the meaning of her words, the layers beneath them. And for the first time that night, I understood that what had happened on that front porch was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a correction that had been waiting for the right moment. And Eleanor inclined her head slightly, her voice quieter now, but no less certain. And tomorrow, she said, they will learn exactly how wrong they were. The room remained still after Eleanor spoke, but it was not the kind of stillness that follows uncertainty. It was the kind that comes after a decision has already been made, and everything else simply needs to catch up to it. And I found myself sitting a little straighter in the chair without realizing it, as if my body had finally aligned with something my mind had only just begun to accept. And Eleanor rose slowly, her movements precise and unhurried, and walked toward a long desk near the far wall where a stack of neatly arranged folders waited, untouched but clearly prepared in advance. And she selected one without hesitation, turning back toward me with the same composed expression, placing it gently on the table between us. And for a moment she did not open it. She simply rested her hand on top, as if allowing me the space to understand what it represented before seeing the details inside. And then she spoke, her voice calm and steady. Your husband made certain arrangements years ago, and at the mention of him something softened inside me, not with grief, but with recognition, because I knew exactly what kind of man he had been, careful, deliberate, always thinking 3 steps ahead even when no one else noticed. And Eleanor opened the folder, revealing a set of documents that were as orderly as everything else in this house, and she turned them slightly so I could read, her finger resting lightly on a line near the top, and I leaned forward, my eyes moving over the familiar language of ownership, of names and dates and signatures, and then stopping, fixed on one detail that shifted everything into place. My name, not as a resident, not as a dependent, but as the primary holder, clear and undeniable. And for a moment I said nothing, not because I did not understand, but because I was allowing the truth to settle fully, to replace the quiet doubt that had been planted in me over the years. And Eleanor watched me closely, not interrupting, not explaining further, trusting me to reach the conclusion on my own. And when I finally looked up at her, she gave a slight nod, confirming what I had already begun to feel. They assumed you had been allowed to stay, she said evenly, when in fact, they were the ones being allowed. And the weight of that distinction settled over me with a quiet force, reshaping everything that had happened earlier that evening, every word, every look, every decision. And I let out a slow breath, not of relief, but of understanding, and Eleanor closed the folder with a soft, deliberate motion. In the morning, she continued, her tone unchanged, they will receive formal notice. And there was no need for her to explain what that meant, because the implications were already clear, precise, and final, and I felt no urgency, no need to rush ahead of what was coming, only a steady sense that the course had already been set. And Eleanor stepped closer, her gaze meeting mine with quiet certainty. This is not about punishment, she said, her voice lowering slightly. It is about correction. And I nodded once, because for the first time I understood that what I had mistaken for loss was actually the beginning of something being restored. And as the room fell silent again, I realized that somewhere far away Daniel and Sophia were still trying to make sense of a night they believed had ended in their favor, unaware that by morning, everything they thought they understood would be rewritten without a single raised voice. Morning arrived without urgency, the light filtering softly through tall windows as if nothing extraordinary had been set into motion, and I sat at the breakfast table across from Eleanor with a cup of coffee warming my hands, the quiet ticking of a distant clock marking time in a way that felt deliberate rather than rushed. And for the first time in years, I was not thinking about what needed to be done to keep peace, not adjusting myself to fit into someone else's expectations. I was simply present. And Eleanor glanced at me once before returning her attention to the neatly arranged documents beside her plate, already signed, already prepared, as if the outcome had never been in question. And she spoke without looking up, her tone as steady as the morning itself. They will receive it within the hour. And I nodded, not asking for details because I did not need them. The certainty in her voice was enough. And outside the long driveway remained still, the gates closed, the world beyond them continuing as it always had, unaware of the shift that was about to reach it. And I found myself thinking not of anger or regret, but of clarity, the kind that strips away every excuse you once made for others, leaving only what is real. And I realized that Daniel had not changed overnight. He had revealed himself slowly, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to misunderstand. And Sophia had simply recognized it sooner and used it to her advantage, and the thought did not sting the way it might have before. It settled instead into a quiet acceptance, because now I could see it without distortion, and Eleanor set her cup down with a soft, precise motion, turning her gaze toward me. "They will try to call you," she said, not as a warning but as a statement of fact. "They will not understand at first." And I held her gaze, my voice calm. "I know," and there was no hesitation in me, no lingering need to explain myself to them, because whatever they chose to feel or believe would not change what had already been decided. And a moment later the man from the previous evening appeared again in the doorway, his posture straight, his expression neutral, and he gave a small nod. "It has been delivered," he said, and Eleanor inclined her head once in acknowledgement, dismissing him with a glance, and the room returned to its quiet rhythm. But I felt the shift immediately, not because anything here had changed, but because something elsewhere had, something that would ripple outward in ways Daniel and Sophia had not prepared for, and I imagined the moment the envelope would be opened, the careful wording, the unmistakable authority behind it, the realization beginning to form, slow at first and then all at once. And for a brief second I allowed myself to picture the house again, the same doorway, the same front steps where I had stood just hours before. And I understood now that nothing about that place had truly belonged to them. Not the walls, not the space, not even the certainty they had carried so confidently. And Eleanor's voice broke gently into my thoughts, quieter now but no less firm. "This is where you decide who you are moving forward." And I looked at her, then down at my hands, steady and still, and for the first time I answered without hesitation, "I already have." The phone rang just as Eleanor had said it would, the sound sharp against the quiet of the room, and for a moment I simply looked at it where it rested on the table, the screen lighting up with Daniel's name, steady and persistent, as if repetition alone could undo what had already been set in motion. And I did not reach for it immediately. I let it ring, once, twice, 3 times, each second stretching long enough for me to feel the weight of the choice in front of me, not whether to answer, but who I would be when I did. And across from me Eleanor said nothing. She did not need to. Her presence alone was enough to remind me that this moment was not about reacting, it was about deciding. And when I finally picked up the phone my voice was calm, measured, unchanged. "Yes," I said, and on the other end there was a pause, brief but unmistakable, as if Daniel had expected something different, something softer, something uncertain. And then his voice came through, rushed, uneven. "Mom, what is this? We just got some letter. It says the house, it says we have to vacate. There has to be a mistake." And I listened without interrupting, not because I needed to hear the explanation, but because I recognized the pattern, the same urgency, the same assumption that everything could be corrected if addressed quickly enough. And when he finished, I allowed a small silence to settle between us before I spoke, my words clear and steady. "There is no mistake." And the shift on the other end was immediate, confusion giving way to something sharper, something closer to disbelief. "What do you mean, no mistake, Mom? This is my house," he said, and I could almost see him standing there, pacing, trying to anchor himself to a certainty that no longer existed. And I closed my eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement of how deeply that belief had been rooted. And then I answered, "It never was." And the silence that followed felt different, heavier, as if the words had landed in a place he had not prepared to question. And when he spoke again his voice had changed, lower now, edged with something unfamiliar. "Mom, we can talk about this. You do not have to do this." And for a moment I considered the years behind those words, the times I had adjusted, compromised, softened myself to keep peace, and I realized how easily that pattern could try to return if I allowed it. And I opened my eyes, my gaze steady, my voice unchanged. "I am not doing anything," I said. "I am correcting something." And there was another pause, longer this time, and in that silence I could hear movement in the background, Sophia's voice faint, but urgent, asking questions he could not answer. And I understood then that they were only just beginning to see the full shape of what had happened. And Daniel spoke again, quieter now. "Where are you?" he asked, and I let the question settle for a moment before responding, not with distance but with clarity. "Somewhere I am not waiting to be let inside." And I ended the call before he could reply. Not out of anger, but because there was nothing left to explain, and as I set the phone back down, the room returned to its calm, unchanged, and Eleanor watched me for a moment, her expression steady, before giving a small, approving nod, and I realized that for the first time, the silence between actions did not feel like something to fill. It felt like something I had finally earned. The house felt different that afternoon, not because anything had changed within its walls, but because something inside me had finally settled into place, and I stood by the window looking out over the long driveway as sunlight stretched across the stone like a quiet reminder that time moves forward whether we are ready for it or not. And for the first time in years, I was not waiting for a call, not anticipating a reaction, not bracing for someone else's decision. I was simply standing there, present in a moment that belonged entirely to me, and behind me I could hear the soft movement of Eleanor as she crossed the room, her steps measured, unhurried, and when she stopped beside me she did not look out the window. She looked at me, as if the view she was interested in was not outside but standing right there in front of her, and after a moment she spoke, her voice calm, almost reflective. "They will come to understand eventually." And I let those words settle without responding immediately, because I knew she was not speaking about regret or reconciliation. She was speaking about clarity, the kind that does not arrive all at once but reveals itself slowly, piece by piece, until there is nothing left to misunderstand, and I nodded slightly, my gaze still on the open space beyond the gates. "Maybe," I said, and there was no bitterness in my voice, no need to prove a point, only a quiet acceptance of what was no longer mine to carry, and Eleanor inclined her head just once, as if that answer was enough, and then she turned away, leaving me there with the stillness I had once feared but now understood, and I remained by the window for a long moment, letting the silence stretch without filling it, letting it exist without trying to soften it, and I realized that respect had never been something that could be demanded from me. It was something that had always been present, in every sacrifice, every compromise, every quiet decision I had made to hold a family together, and the only thing that had changed was that I no longer needed to offer it where it was not returned. And as I turned from the window, I felt no urgency to move, no need to rush into what came next, because for the first time I was not reacting to a moment, I was choosing one. And as I walked toward the doorway, the light followed me in a way that felt almost symbolic, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady and certain, and I understood then that what had happened on that porch had not taken anything from me. It had revealed everything I had almost forgotten, and somewhere far beyond those gates, Daniel and Sophia were beginning to face the consequences of a single sentence they had believed carried authority, unaware that respect had never been something they could withhold, only something they had already lost. And as I stepped fully into the next room, I did not look back, because there was nothing behind me that still belonged to who I had become.